I find myself in a unique position. A position where I can speak Japanese and Irish, to varying degrees, and where I actually need to be able to tell Japanese speakers how to pronounce and write Irish words, especially names, for my job. In other words, I need to be able to spell, or transcribe, Irish words in Japanese. I've thought long and hard about how to do this, and now I'm going to tell you all how I got on. As a teaser, you end up having to write skull, the Irish word for school, as scuddy. I'll be starting with some basics in both Japanese and Irish, and the basics of representing and comparing sounds of different languages in general. So if you have an interest in either Japanese or Irish, or in linguistics as a whole, I promise you'll find this interesting. Okay, first I need to explain why this is something I need to worry about at all. I just told you I need to be able to tell Japanese speakers how to pronounce and write Irish words. A lot of yous might think, what you mean? Just say the word to them and show them the spelling. But it's not that simple. First of all, I'm sure everyone's at least vaguely familiar with the fact that Japanese has a different writing system from us. Now, I'm sure that's got you thinking. Yeah, actually, how do you write non-Japanese words in Japanese? Allow me to introduce you to Japanese writing. First of all, Japanese has a large set of characters, mostly borrowed from Chinese, called kanji. Now, kanji do not represent sounds. They represent meanings. This is the kanji for fish. It's evolved over time from an actual drawing of a fish. This is the kanji for big. It's a picture of a fella gesturing, like, I once caught a fish that was this big, I swear. There are 2136 kanji, which the Japanese must learn in mandatory education, and far more kanji that actually get used and most native Japanese speakers will be able to read. Fortunately, this is not what we have to deal with today. Japanese also has two sets of characters which are used to write sounds, hiragana and katakana. They're used in different situations but represent the same sounds. Think of it like this. English and Irish actually technically have two alphabets. You have to learn the lowercase and uppercase version of each letter, and it's not at all obvious to someone learning for the first time that a capital D looks like this, but a small d looks like this. Anyway, in Japanese, when writing foreign words and names, or loan words from other languages, we use katakana. Okay, so our goal, in other words, is to figure out how to write Irish in katakana. Let's look at what we're working with here. I think it's important to introduce all of the characters here to grasp the challenge that lies ahead. First, the leftmost column here is our vowels. A, I, U, E, and O. Let me make something very clear. In English and Irish, the letters of the alphabet have names. For example, the letter E is called E in English, right? But it's not necessarily pronounced E. It can be pronounced E, as in evil or Ebert, but a letter E on its own is much more likely to be pronounced isn't it? As in bed, get, pen, leg, etc. Japanese doesn't have this issue whatsoever. When I tell you that this is the Japanese character I, and this is the Japanese character I'm telling you that this is always pronounced I, and this is always pronounced E. The names of these characters are exactly the same as their pronunciations. Now, this means that Japanese has what you might call a 5-vowel system. There are 5 vowel sounds in Japanese, and that's it. This is actually pretty common around the world. Spanish also has 5 vowels, and they're very similar to the Japanese ones. Unfortunately for Japanese, the most important foreign language to learn in the world these days is English, which has a very high number of vowel sounds. But Irish is not too bad in this department. We'll keep turning the sounds here before we get on to how to use them to represent Irish. Next, we have consonant-vowel combinations. Ka, ki, ku, ke, and ko. That's right. This is the most important thing to grasp when tackling the issue here. Have you noticed I've been calling these symbols characters and not letters? And I've avoided calling katakana an alphabet this whole time? That's because it's not an alphabet. It's a syllabary. An alphabet has letters like A and B in the Roman alphabet, or alpha and beta in the Greek alphabet. And these can represent vowels or consonants and combine to form syllables. In a syllabary, like in Japanese, the fundamental unit of the writing system is the syllable. Japanese has no symbol for the K consonant on its own. There's only ka, ki, ku, ke, and ko. Now, are there any smart viewers watching right now? Think about this while we proceed. How could you write the English word attack, which ends in a k sound, without any following vowel? We're going to pick up the pace now as we move on. Sa, shi, su, se, so. Ta, chi, tsu, te, to. Na, ni, nu, ne, no. Ha, hi, hu, he, ho. Ma, mi, mu, me, mo. Ya, yu, yo. Da, di, du, de, do. Wa, o. And then, finally, we have Japanese's one and only lone consonant, n. Let's discuss the sounds that stand out to us here. You may have noticed that, while many of the consonant columns like ma, mi, mu, me, mo and da, di, du, de, do are very regular, consisting of that column's consonant sound followed by each row's respective vowel sound, some combinations seems to break the pattern, so to speak. Instead of sa, si, su, se, so, we get sa, shi, su, se, so. This is a pattern we can see almost across the board here. Instead of ti, we get chi. And while this difference may be hard for some to hear, instead of he, we get he. Now the thing is, there's actually a slight difference across the board in the I row here. So even ni, mi, and di, and ki have different consonants from the rest of the letters in their respective columns. This is actually very significant for our purposes here, because this is pretty similar to the broad, slender distinction for consonants in Irish, isn't it? Remember, this is pronounced sli, but this is pronounced she. This is cod, but this is cad. Maybe Japanese is better suited to transcribe in Irish than you might think at first. Moving on to the other irregularities here. Instead of tu, we have tsu. I actually don't have a cool explanation or story behind this one, but it's worth remembering later. Instead of hu, we get fu. This is actually a holdover of older forms of Japanese, where this H column was actually an F column. Note that what we will call Japanese F is pronounced with your two lips, or bilabially, as opposed to English F, which is made by putting your top teeth on your bottom lip, or labiodentally. So it's not fu, but fu. English-speaking students are often told to imagine they're blowing out a candle to make this sound. Next, we might as well note some striking absences here. There's no yi or ye, and no wi, wu, or we. Also, the character here, whose position on the chart would suggest wo, is actually just pronounced o. It's the exact same as this o, and thus won't be of any use to us here. Now, we're getting through these sounds at a good pace. Japanese isn't quite as limited as it would seem from just these base characters alone. You can also add these fellas, called dakuten, to some of the characters to change them from an unvoiced consonant to a voiced consonant. Try this for yourself. Make an S sound with no vowel before or after. Just go s. Now do the same, but make a Z sound. Z. The only difference between these two is that Z uses your vocal cords, but S doesn't. That's what makes Z a voiced consonant and S an unvoiced consonant. So ka, ki, ku, ke, ko become ga, gi, gu, ge, go. The S sound in sa, su, se, and so doesn't quite become a Z sound, as it's actually more commonly pronounced Z in standard Japanese, at least word initially. So za, zu, ze, zo. Shi becomes ji, and not ji, as you might expect. There's a bit of a plosive there. It's not a pure fricative. Ta, te, to become da, de, do. Chi becomes ji, identical to this ji, and thus rarely used. Tsu becomes zu, identical to this zu, and thus rarely used. Now remember how the character here in the U row of the H column is actually pronounced like a bilabial F sound, fu, and that this H column was historically an F column. Well, that explains why this column becomes a B column when you put on dakuten. So ha, hi, fu, he, ho becomes ba, bi, bu, be, bo. There's one more special character you can add just to the H column. You can add this circle called a han dakuten to make P sounds. So pa, pi, pu, pe, po. Okay, we've just 3 things left to cover, I swear. These characters, ya, yu, yo, can be made small and added to these lads in the I row to make combos of these consonants, which, since we're talking about Irish here, we'll call the slender consonants, with other vowels besides I. So ki plus ya, you, or yo gives us kya, kyu, or kyo. Shi can combine to give us sha, shu, sho, etc. Next, this horizontal line extends vowel sounds to be 2 syllables long. So a, ke, sho, sho. Finally, this character, tsu, can be written small before a sound starting with a consonant to extend the consonant sound to be 2 syllables long. So asa, asa, koto, koto, maka, maka. And there you go. You've just mastered katakana. And now you can write all the sounds that traditionally exist in Japanese. Before I start actually getting into how we compare sounds in Irish and Japanese, I want to very quickly go over the guidelines I've tried to follow in coming up with my system. Number 1, consistency in the transcription of phonemes. If I decide that the on at the end of porton should be written in Japanese as on, then I shouldn't go using a different sound for other words with the same ending just because I think it's pronounced slightly differently. Number 2, legibility. An average Japanese speaker needs to be able to read the spellings I come up with. And number 3, recognizability. I tried as hard as I could to make the katakana spellings as phonetically close to the Irish as possible, while still following rules 1 and 2. Not all of these rules could be followed at all times. You'll see. Let's go. Did you know there's actually a good textbook out there written in Japanese for learning Irish? It's this book right here. New Express Plus Irish by Professor Nashimoto Kunina. Professor Nashimoto obtained his PhD in Irish at Galway University and lectured at University of Limerick for 10 years. It's really great and the characters throughout the book are very cute. I'd recommend it to any Japanese speakers interested in Irish, for whatever reason that may be. As you can see here, the author has come up with a way to write the pronunciation of words in katakana for the Japanese readers of this book. So wait, this has already been done? What's the point of this video? Why don't I just use this fella's system? He seems more qualified than me, right? Well, there's 2 main reasons why I decided to make my own system. Firstly, this textbook is focused entirely on the Irish of Closhadige in Connemara. This dialect has some features not found in any other that have a large impact on the katakana transcription. For example, all a sounds in Closhadige are long, so the author had to use long a to transcribe the sound of an a without a fada. We'll get into what that means later. Secondly, I just disagree with the author's choices. I'll mention some of the things I disagree with as we encounter them. Now, I mentioned dialect just now, didn't I? We should discuss that very briefly. For those of you who don't know much about Irish, which includes most Irish people, don't worry, the Irish language has quite a lot of dialect variation. The dialects are usually put into 3 major groups based on the provinces of modern-day Ireland: Munster, Connacht and Ulster. This patch here is in Leinster, but it's actually a settlement created by the government in the 1930s and was populated mostly by people from Connacht. Look it up, it's mad interesting. There's plenty of variation within these major groups as well, of course. Closhadige, which the Irish textbook I mentioned uses, is here. Here's just a random sample of words to give you a flavour of the differences.
Coin,
coin,
Cane,
pole,
pole,
pull,
tain,
teen,
tin,
kaidan,
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 kultur,
culture,
culture.
Okay, then I'm just going to have to pick a dialect of my own, right? How will my choice be any better than that of the Japanese textbook? Well, actually, I'm going to choose none of them. I'm going to use the Lord-Chanuts, or core dialects, which is actually a pronunciation system made by Professor Emeritus Donald P. O'Boyle. The Lord-Chanuts was made to provide a pronunciation guide in a well-known Irish-English dictionary, and to serve as a basis for education of Irish pronunciation. 2 of its most important characteristics are that its pronunciations conform to the standard spelling of words better than any single living dialect, and that all its sounds are taken from at least one living dialect. Overall, by not limiting itself to any one particular living dialect when choosing its features, it manages to avoid any of the standout features that makes any particular dialect hard to understand for people who aren't native speakers of that dialect, as well as avoid diverging too dramatically from the spelling. Any more discussion of dialects and the Lord-Chanuts really deserves its own video. So let's move on and actually start writing Irish and Japanese. Okay, so from now on, I'm going to say Irish has this or that, and you can assume I'm talking about the Lord-Chanuts. Irish has 11 pure vowels, or monophthongs. A, I, U, E, A, I, U, E, O, and A, I, U, E, and are called the short vowels, and are usually spelt in words with the same vowel symbol that they are given here. A, I, U, E, and O are called the long vowels, and are usually spelt with the same vowel symbol with an accent on top. This accent is called a síne fada in Irish, and most learners of Irish think it's just called a fada. Lastly, is called a schwa, and I'll explain that more later. You might think we're just fucked now, since Japanese has only 5 vowels, but those of you with the knowledge of Irish or IPA will know that these vowel sounds here are just considered the long versions of these ones here, even though the pronunciation isn't actually the same, like the long and short vowels in Japanese. So, since Japanese has a system for extending its vowels, we can think of Japanese as having 10 available vowel sounds for transcription. So, if things go really well, we might only have to merge 2 Irish vowels into 1 Japanese vowel. Okay, so finally, it's time to choose which Irish sounds go to which Japanese sounds. Let's start with the short vowels. A goes with Japanese a. Rather self-explanatory. It's worth noting here that there's some variation in the pronunciation of these sounds in both languages. In Irish, short a can be pronounced like a or a, and it can actually be mandatory which one to use. For example, I've never seen the word ats pronounced ots. Which pronunciation to use is usually obvious and natural based on the surrounding sounds though. I think the 2 competing pronunciations are considered to be in complementary distribution, and that's why the Lord is comfortable with considering them the same phoneme. Japanese a can also vary, but it's much safer to say that this doesn't have an impact on meaning. It can be anything from a to a, depending on the speaker's mood, gender, etc. Now, you might be wondering what the hell I was talking about when I mentioned complementary distribution, and phonemes even. I'm going to make this quick, as we've had so many tangents already and there's more to come. A phoneme is a unit of sound that is considered unique and can make the difference between you saying one word or another. So, in English, t and d are 2 different sounds, even though the only difference in reality is that d is a voiced consonant and t is unvoiced. Like we discussed before looking at the katakana chart. So tire and dire are different words in English, and this difference is obvious to native English speakers. Some languages, however, like Maori or Hawaiian, only have 1 T sound, so they don't distinguish T and D, so a monolingual speaker of those languages would find it very hard to hear the difference if, say, they were to start learning English. One phoneme, for example English T, can have a few variants, called allophones. So for example, I usually pronounce this word like bat, but I could pronounce it like bat or bat, and no one would be unsure what I'm saying. So listen to this. There was a bat flying around me house last night. There was a bat flying around me house last night. There was a bat flying around me house last night. Finally, 2 sounds, like I guess a and in the Lárghanúns, can be considered the same phoneme when, even though they're different, there's no 2 words out there where the only difference is whether you say a or a. So there's the word ats, but there's no competing word ots. These 2 sounds only ever appear in words that are sufficiently different from each other. They're in complementary distribution. Last note on this, there's a system called the IPA used for writing down more precisely the pronunciation of words. When you write inside forward slashes, you're denoting phonemes. So this signifies the word bat as pronounced in English, but allowing for variation among the allophones of T. If you write inside square brackets, you're denoting phones, the actual exact sounds being made. So bat would be written like this, bat like this, and bat like this. Last note on notation, if you put a letter in pointy brackets, that means you're talking about the letter as a letter in the spelling of a word. There's a YouTuber called Klein who has a good video on these concepts, so I'll link them in the description. Now, back to writing Irish and Japanese. Next, short I goes to Japanese I. Short E goes to Japanese I. Now, here we are, the controversial ones. Let's talk about Irish short O. It's spelt with an O, but it's not pronounced like O in any dialect of English that I'm aware of. And it's not pronounced like Japanese O. I can't speak for every part of the country, but if you grew up anywhere in Dublin or the commuter belt like me, then you probably say these words in English the same. Book, book, tuck, tuck, look, look, and so on. And also, you probably learnt in school to pronounce Irish short O and U the same, didn't you? You probably say the following words like this: Rusmuck, Gub, Fud, Cuss. And in fact, there is a minority of academics out there who will say that Irish short O and U are phonemically the same sound in at least some dialects. They claim that, while there may be two vowel sounds, and they are in complementary distribution. This means there's no two words out there where the only difference is whether you pronounce the vowel as or Most Irish academics, however, as far as I understand, disagree, and they do so very annoyingly by writing the pronunciation of Irish short O like this. This symbol, from my understanding and experience, would imply that Irish short O is pronounced something like Japanese O, or how a standard accent of English in England would pronounce short O. You know, like, you got a bottle of water, mate. But that's just clearly not the case for Irish short O. Listen to some examples.
Clocha,
Clocha.
Clocha.
croc,
Crook.
Knock.
cogu,
Cogga.
Cogga.
cosh,
Cush.
Cush.
Okay, so what does the Lord Chanunts have to say about this? Well, the Lord Chanunts says to pronounce short U like the vowel sounds in the English words should and good. As I've explained, I, and perhaps the majority of people around my age or younger in Ireland at this stage, also pronounce English short U with the same sound. That is, I pronounce look and look the same, and I pronounce should and shudder with the same vowel sound. But here's the problem. The author also says to pronounce short O like the U in English, as in son, bus, and but. To make things even doubly confusing, he actually describes it as the vowels in the words son, bus, and but, etc., as pronounced in the English of Ireland. This floored me when I first read it. I felt like I was spiraling. As I just described, the way I pronounce U in English is the same as how Irish short U is pronounced. So what's going on here? Am I and half the country not actually speaking the English of Ireland? Well, the creator of the Lord Chanunts is from Ulster. So he, unlike me, does have a distinction between look and look, like most Americans and Brits would have. So what he means here is for Irish short O to be pronounced like the U in look for people with that distinction. He wants it to be pronounced like somewhere thereabouts. So like how Americans would say lock, or how Brits would say lock. I genuinely don't know if I can even make different sounds for that phoneme for those two accents. Americans and Brits probably think they pronounce look slightly different from each other, but it all sounds the same to me, and I definitely don't feel confident in my impression of them. So I wouldn't be surprised if my exact realization of Irish short O isn't what the author had in mind specifically, but the main important thing is that there's a phonemic distinction. As long as I'm making different vowel sounds for short O and short U, and that they're in the correct ballpark, then as far as I'm concerned, I'm doing a good job as a language learner. You can let me know if you disagree in the comments. And also, let's leave that whole comment about the English of Ireland behind us and just move on, shall we? Okay, so what's the closest sound in Japanese to the short O and short U? Well, you might not like me answer here, but they're clearly Japanese A for Irish short O and Japanese O for Irish short U. Listen, English short U, which remember is by literal definition in the Lord Chanunts identical to Irish short O, is transcribed with Japanese A. Look, in Japanese, is written rakker. As for Irish short U, you tell me which is closer. Here's a native Irish speaker from each dialect making this noise.
cor,
A cur.
Cor.
fluch,
Floch.
Fluch.
Now tell me which of these is closest.
あいうえ o,
It's clearly Japanese o.
Fluch.
o,
I've very deliberately avoided writing the vowels on this chart in Roman letters up to now, because these are the Romanizations of the vowels. If you're looking at this, you probably think I'm mad to be assigning Irish short O to so-called Japanese A, and Irish short U to so-called Japanese O, while leaving so-called Japanese U unused. But that's exactly why I've hidden this Romanization from you. Japanese U just isn't close enough to any of the Irish short vowels. The Romanizations here are a complete distraction from that fact. The Japanese textbook I mentioned earlier is clearly suffering from the influence of this Romanization, because it does use Japanese U for Irish short U and Japanese O for Irish short O, as you'd naively expect. But you tell me, which of these sounds like a more accurate approximation of the Irish word fud?
futto, foddo,
Fud.
foddo,
I rest my case. We really need to move on. This vowel here, the schwa, is the last short vowel, and it appears in unstressed syllables in both Irish and English. It's the vowel in the second syllable in words like autumn, buachel, autumn, and the first syllable in words like omarach, nacht, inyo. However, in words like inyo, that I just said last, it's clearly pronounced like a short I, and I will be transcribing it as such in katakana. For all other cases, it gets lumped into Japanese a, same as how Japanese handles English schwa most of the time. Okay, finally, the long vowels. This is going to be so much quicker. Irish long a gets Japanese long a. Now, English a, like in the word awesome, is very close to Irish long a, and that goes to Japanese long o. So, awesome. But I think this is done for two reasons. One, some dialects of English, like received pronunciation, pronounce it more like o. So you might hear an English person sound more like awesome, raw, authentic. 2. This might also be to make room for English and r, which are transcribed to Japanese a. So for example, both heard and hard become hado, and awkward becomes okuado. Not assigning too many different English sounds to the same Japanese sound might have been a consideration. Irish doesn't have either of these concerns. Also, this is how people in Ulster pronounce long a.
Klein.
So it would really be leaving them out if we used Japanese o. Next, Irish long e gets Japanese long e. They're almost identical. Maybe they literally are identical. Irish long e goes to Japanese long e. Irish long o now actually pairs well with Japanese long o. In fact, they seem the exact same to me. And Irish long u similarly now matches well with Japanese long u. Although the Japanese u isn't rounded, at least in standard Japanese, it's still clearly the closest. Last thing for the vowels, the Lord Hanuns has these diphthongs. Ia, ua, I, au. These go very comfortably with the Japanese combinations ia, ua, I, au. Finally, vowels done. Almost all Irish consonants have a broad and slender variant. Broad consonants appear next to a, o, and u. Slender consonants appear next to e and I. In our variant of IPA notation that we use specially for Irish, we denote broad consonants with just the consonant symbol, and we add a dash for the slender ones. So, cad, but cad. Páca, but paca. Scanan, but scrad. This is similar to how the letter C changes pronunciation in English, Spanish, or French when it's before an E or an I, except for two key details. First, the broad and slender variants actually use the same point of articulation. Like, it makes no sense to a Japanese person learning English that the same letter would be pronounced k sometimes, but su some other times. But t and t actually make sense together. They're made with the same part of your mouth. Secondly, the pronunciation is affected by vowels on the right and the left of the consonant. This means that consonants in the middle of a word have to be surrounded by either broad or slender vowels on both sides. The result is a lot of vowels which are there more to indicate the broadness or slenderness of a consonant than to actually be pronounced as vowels. similar to how so many words in English end in E just to let you know that the C at the end is pronounced like an S. But the spelling of Irish is actually quite regular, actually much more so than English. So it's only occasionally ambiguous as to which vowel is doing which job, especially in the láir chanúns. Recall that Japanese consonants actually do something similar, which is surprisingly promising. The láir chanúns has these consonants. I'll read them all left to right now. P, T, K, P, T, Ch, K. B, D, G, B, Z, J, G. F, S, H, H, F, Sh, H, V, Z, R, V, Z, Y, M, N, Ng, M, Ny, Ny. I'll often refer to these sounds by their symbols here. So when I say K, I'm talking about both broad K and slender K. And when I want to distinguish between one or the other, I will be referring to broad K or slender K. So let's start with K. Simple enough, broad K can be written with the Japanese K column, choosing the correct character dependent on the following vowel using the vowel conversion system we chose in the last section. Except for I. On the occasion that broad K is followed by I or E, as in kids or kui, we will have to use kui. Oh, you never told them about kui. What do you mean they don't know about kui? You never actually told them all the sounds. I didn't actually teach them all there is to know about katakana. Okay, so, you see, remember in the first chapter, I actually said that you learnt all the traditional sounds of Japanese. Well, yeah, so Japanese has actually quite recently come up with new ways of writing sounds that didn't traditionally exist in their language. This is mostly to facilitate more English loanwords. And it's recent enough that some older Japanese speakers today still aren't comfortable enough with using them. For example, tsu and fu can be combined with a small a, I, e, or o to get tsa, tsi, tse, tso, and fa, fi, fe, fo. So now, Japanese is actually back to having a full column of F sounds, in a way. There's still no common way to write hu, and even Japanese native speakers proficient in English still struggle to make that sound. I think you can write it like this, but it's very rare and no good if people can't say it anyway. Remember rule 2, lads. You can put a small e after any of these sounds in the I row to make up for the lack of a ye sound in the Y column. So now we've ye, kye, gye, she, je, etc. You can put small I after su to get si, and after te to get ti. And you can put small wa, I, e, or o after these characters to indicate a glide vowel like a W sound. So kwa, gwa, swa, etc. Finally, you can put a dakuten on the vowel u to indicate a voiced bilabial fricative, v, and this is sometimes used to transcribe a V sound, whereas traditionally, and still quite commonly, V sounds are substituted with B sounds. I've actually heard native Japanese speakers naturally use this sound though, so it might be coming into fashion, for loanwords that is. You can add a small a, I, e, or o to get the full set, so va, vi, v, ve, vo. If I'm forgetting anything else, I'll mention them later. Some of these still aren't widely used, but are familiar enough to be readable. I don't often see the combos for W sounds, for example, except after the U vowel to make we, we, and wo. And there seems to be some confusion amongst Japanese speakers over whether this should be pronounced si or sui. Japanese still seems to prefer just following up an U sound with a regular I vowel. So queen is rendered as queen instead of queen. Fa, fi, fu, fe, fo, we, we, wo, and ti and di have totally caught on though. So yeah, quids and qui can be rendered quidji and qui. As I said, the small vowels after U consonants to indicate a W sound aren't that popular for transcribing English, but it still seems common enough that any Japanese speaker will know what is meant. When a word ends in a broad K consonant, we will use ku at the end of the word. This isn't a random choice at all. You see, Japanese speakers do sometimes say a consonant without pronouncing, or at least without voicing, the following vowel. This is called devoicing, and it happens for these fellas on the E and U rows. It only happens when the devoiced sound is not followed by a voiced consonant. And there's a few more conditions as well. This fella has a good video on the whole process, so watch it here. So the long and short of it is that k and ki will often sound like k and ki. Also, to signify a word final consonant, we will geminate the consonant. That is, we will use small ts to make it a long consonant. So muk will become muk, and bok will become bok. We don't do this after a long vowel though, so jok will be joke. This is how it's done in English, and I see no reason not to do the same for Irish. By the way, this answers the question I asked earlier in the katakana introduction chapter. The English word attack becomes attack. Slender k can be made by following ki, followed by a small vowel if required. One particular thing I want to draw attention to is that I will use kye for slender k, followed by a schwa at the end of a word. But for the middle of a word, I'll use ki. So fekye will be fekye, but fekymids will be fekimidji. I will similarly use the e row for other slender word endings like this. And this is something that the Japanese textbook almost does as well. It uses small ya at the end, so it would have fekya. Close enough, but farther from the correct vowel sound in my opinion. Anyway, we do this because, as mentioned above, the I row consonants tend to devoice. So if we used feki for fekye, it would sound more like fek. For the Irish word fek, we will use a geminated consonant as discussed earlier. So fek. We obviously treat broad and slender G the same way as K, just with dakuten on the same Japanese characters. That is, we use ga, gi, gu, ge, go, etc. instead of ka, ki, gu, ge, ko, etc. Okay, next, let's tackle S. This is very similar to K. Words like sasana will obviously be written sasana, and sha will be written sha. Again, similar to K, broad s followed by an I or E will use the U row followed by a small E. I mentioned before that this is a bit ambiguous to Japanese speakers, whether it should be si or sui, and in my experience the preference is actually for sui. But this mimics the Irish glide vowels well anyway. For the pedants watching this video, note that the Japanese U vowel and W consonant aren't rounded. So this isn't the same as an English speaker saying sui. Su and shi devoice such that you can accomplish consonant clusters involving them quite well. So skanan becomes skanan. Skull becomes scuddy. Let's talk about our R's and L's next. So Japanese speakers are quite famous in the English-speaking world for failing to distinguish R and L. This has become a racist stereotype extended to other East Asians who don't even have this problem, and it can sometimes be a bit uncomfortable to bring up, but it's real. Japanese uses the da, di, du, de, do column to transcribe both English R and English L. They similarly do so for both consonants in Spanish, French, German, and the like, and we will do the same here. It's the closest consonant to both sounds, and there are no alternatives. Slender R at the end of a word, however, will go to z, as it's a fricative in Irish. That's right, for those of you who didn't know, it's not TG Cahir, it's TG Cahid.
Déifar maithasa agus fáilte roimh go nuacht TG Cahid. TG Cahid. Cahid.
One original thing I'll bring to the table that's different from the textbook is that I will use D to indicate a final slender L. To be clear, D and R have very similar consonants. But I don't see why we can't still use D to indicate that the original consonant in Irish is slender, and R to indicate it's broad. The textbook prefers to use R for both, and indicate slenderness with a prefixed small e. It also does this for m at the end of a word. I think this is madness, as not only is it ambiguous as to whether a small e like this is a prefix to the last character or a suffix to the previous character, but even when it's clearly not the latter, all Japanese speakers I've shown this to just think it should be read as a vowel. I've literally shown this to people who speak both languages, corrected them for pronouncing the e as a vowel, explained that it indicates the following consonant is slender, and they continued to say it as a vowel. The main reason I'm making this transcription system is to spell Irish names in Japanese for my colleagues, so such a demonstrably unintuitive system is definitely no good. I think the insistence on using de and m with a weird prefix for slender l and m instead of just using d and mi is also because of English brain rot. Word final l and m in English words are always transcribed with de and m. To be clear, de and m never devoice, so this is simply to match the pattern of using the row like the majority of other consonants. And yet, I myself can't help but intuitively feel like scatter is a better transcription for skull rather than scotty. It's like years of experience with katakana English has made my brain think that the vowel at the end of scatter isn't there, but it absolutely is. Maybe this is how the author of the Japanese textbook felt, but this bias needs to get lost, in my opinion. Last point in favour of doing it my way, transcriptions of Russian, which also has a similar distinction for soft and hard L, do what I am proposing. Final hard L is D, and final soft L is D. For example, Barnaul ends with a hard L and becomes Barunauru, whereas Sevastopol ends with a soft L and becomes Sevastopoli. Just in case it needs to be made clear, I just didn't attempt the Russian pronunciation. I said it Englishy because I'm not confident in my attempt at reading Russian. So don't worry if you didn't hear a difference in the L there. That's because I just wasn't trying to actually sound Russian while reading them. Anyway, we mentioned M while we were discussing L and R. Final broad M is M, and final slender M is mi. Let's talk about N next for a bit. So word initial N and mid-word N follow the same patterns we've seen so far. Final N is interesting. Remember that Japanese has one official lone consonant. I've marked it with a tilde in the chart because it's best considered the nasal consonant rather than as an N sound, even though it's just commonly transcribed as an N in Roman letters. The actual pronunciation depends on what comes after it. The following is my simplified understanding of how it works. You can go read online somewhere about the nitty-gritty details. If it's in front of any consonant articulated at the alveolar ridge, it's an N. So, anta, anna, anzen. If it's in front of a bilabial, then it's an M. So, ompu, ammari. If it's in front of a velar, it's an ing, like English ng. So, anko, angai. If it's word final, it extends and nasalizes the previous vowel. So, an, on, Finally, a really fucky one, if it's before a vowel, it nasalizes the previous vowel and becomes a nasal u before a, u, o, and a nasal e before e, e. So, senyen, kanwon, inwonka. We're still going to use it at the end of a word if an Irish word ends in n. We're also going to take advantage of its variability by replicating ing sounds with the Japanese n followed by a g consonant. So, pingin becomes pingin, and farishing becomes farishingi. Ch and j are here just for English loanwords and will be rendered with Japanese chi and ji, just as they are in English. Z and z are also for loanwords. Broad z goes to Japanese z, and slender z has to go to the Japanese j. Same as for English z. T and D are straightforward, except that since the U row has a different consonant sound, we will use the O row for final consonants. This is an unfortunate compromise, as these don't devoice, so we'll end up with an unwanted O vowel sound at the end. For example, cod is caddo, cad is caddo, cat is catto, etc. Now, I'm going to say something that seems to contradict what I literally just said. You can put a small U after to and do to get to and do. These sounds are actually common enough these days in loanwords that we will be using them for Irish words, like to. However, as these are non-traditional sounds, they still don't devoice. And also, using to and do for word final T and D is an established practice now. So yeah, like I already just said, cad becomes caddo, but tu becomes tu, and dun becomes dun. Slender t and z are interesting. As you can hear, I personally use a pronunciation written like this. Both of these sounds actually exist in Japanese. You can write ta, ti, tsu, tse, to and za, zi, zu, ze, zo. And I initially really wanted to render these Irish sounds that way. However, we are once again hampered by English brain rot. You see, the one foreign language that Japanese native speakers have extensive contact with is English, and overwhelmingly so. Many Japanese natives with some proficiency in English seem to at least subconsciously recognise that English Z is a pure fricative, whereas Japanese Z usually has a plosive before the fricative. The result is that Japanese native speakers tend to apply what they've picked up from learning English to all foreign languages. So the native speakers I've taught some Irish to tend to struggle with the idea of purposefully saying their Z with a plosive. So fine, Ulster to the rescue. Ulster Irish pronounces its slender T and D like Japanese chi and ji. So that's what we'll use in katakana Irish. So tsanga becomes changa. Ze becomes je. Most of what's left is self-explanatory from the rules we've discussed so far. The last interesting ones are the velar fricatives. Broad h is the property of Japanese h. For all you Irish people watching this who haven't spoken Irish since school, remember that ch is pronounced ch. It's simply not pronounced k. Give Irish the respect it deserves by actually treating it as a foreign language when learning it. As is the case for other languages like Polish, word final ch is written with a geminated ha. For example, I studied maths in Japan and learned that what we called Banach spaces in Ireland were called Banahakukan in Japan, because they're named after a Polish fella with the last name Banach. So ach becomes aha, tacht becomes chahato, chonik becomes hanuik. This sound gets a bit complicated when followed by a consonant. You'll see that I've rendered tacht as chahato. This roughly matches the patterns we've seen so far. I have a geminated ha for ch at the end of a word, so I have an ungeminated ha in mid position. I've seen the German word Achtung rendered Ahatunge, so okay, it all looks fine. But what about words that, say, start with ch followed by another consonant? Say chlon or chros. Well, it seems the done thing is to use f. See, for example, Khrushchev, rendered as Furushchof. I think this is done because f can devoice, so for some combinations you could have the f consonant followed directly by another consonant. So, for example, the Japanese for two people, futari, and the English word gift in katakana, gifto. But remember, vowels don't devoice before voiced consonants, and Japanese R is a voiced consonant. So there's no benefit to suddenly switching to f for the start of words like these. However, ha at the start of a word just seems wrong. I think it's more liable to be pronounced more prominently than the rest of the sounds when it's at the start. So if we used Japanese ha to transcribe the initial ch, it would sound as if you're trying to say chalan or charos. As a compromise, I'm going with ho. This is the most feelsy decision I will make in this entire system, and I might be swayed into changing it to ha or even f if I could speak with people who know more about German, Russian and other languages' katakana transcription schemes. So we end up with horan, and horas. We also end up with the likes of hui going to hoi. Note there's no small e notation here. Anyway, moving on. Slender hi will use Japanese hi. They have perhaps the exact same consonant in most cases. So, hyanui becomes hyanui. Fiche becomes fiche. And kuich becomes kuichi. Broad r has no choice but to go to the G column. So, rine becomes aguine. Ra becomes ga. Slender y before a vowel is pronounced like English y. So it gets the Japanese y column supplemented with y. If it's in front of a short or long I sound, it has no choice but to become I or E respectively. So ziyi becomes ji. Yar becomes yaru. And yoi becomes yoi. In front of a consonant, my understanding is that slender y is a fricative, so grami becomes giriamui. And there you go. All the sounds of Irish put into Japanese katakana. One quick note that might be opening a Pandora's box here is that I have prioritized consonant sounds over glide vowels, if that makes sense. So, like, the word kuig is a very egregious example where the glide vowel before the slender G is very audible, but it's considered a consequence of the slender G at the end rather than a phonemic vowel. So the katakana will be kuugi. As I said, this is a very egregious example where the katakana would sound much more accurate, in my opinion, if we wrote it as kuigi. The Japanese textbook tries to denote glide vowels like this with small vowel katakana characters, and I already expressed my dislike of this when talking about L, R, and M. I think it's the right call not to do this, as you would have to make judgment calls for so many words as to whether or not the glide vowel is prominent enough to warrant representation in the katakana, and that goes against rule 1. To finish up, let's go over some fun sample words and even some sample sentences, as read by my lovely assistant, a native Japanese speaker. Keep in mind though that katakana transcription is hardly ever used to transcribe whole sentences of any language, except in like beginner levels of foreign language lessons for Japanese speakers. Okay, let's go. A hien,
A hin,
a do,
a do,
a tsri,
a chri,
a cahid,
a cahed,
a cúig,
a cúg,
a sé,
a sé,
a seacht,
a shahato,
a hocht,
a hahato,
a nui,
a nui,
a ze,
a je,
a, be, ke, ze, e, f, ge, heish, e, l, m, n, o, p, r, s, t, agus u.
a, be, ke, je, e, f, ge, heishi, i, eri, emi, en, o, pe, l, s, che, agas, u,
Zí ritz,
jia, gwich,
chuna sa táta,
kanas, ata, tu,
tá me go ma.
ta, me, ga, ma,
Cén chuí bhfuil tú,
ken, hoi, wiri, tu,
tá me win na muice.
ta, me, win, na, muike,
Cén tanim atá ort,
ken, tanimi, ata, aruto,
Yamada taro atá orm.
Yamada, taro, ata, arum,
Is zas búla leat,
isu, jas, buara, riato,
le da hol,
le, da, hari,
gur a míle maithagad,
gara, mire, mahagato,
buíochas le dia,
bui, hasu, le, jia,
le cúnmh dé,
le, kunavu, je,
anhíon círó geile.
anhin, kiarog, ere,
Níl tiile dá bhéad nach drán,
니리 티레 다 베도 나 하도랑.
Okay, we're at the end of the video. I'd like to use the rest of the time here to just get in some last notes that I want to make just in front of a black screen. First of all, I go pretty hard on the Japanese textbook system throughout the video, but it's really not a bad book first of all. I really love it. In defense of at least some of the book's choices, it is intended to be used for the purposes of learning the language. And there are notes in the beginning explaining parts where you're actually supposed to read the katakana in novel ways. So, for example, I mention in the video that the word ri is spelt in katakana in the textbook in a way that looks like it should be read fi. However, the book does explain at the start that the use of fu in such places is intended as a fricative version of ku. That's the phrasing in the book. So a Japanese speaker using the book to learn Irish and paying close attention would know that the fu there is actually meant to be read something like hu. The purpose of my system that I've come up with though is to transcribe Irish into Japanese using the actual sounds that exist in Japanese. It has to be readable and pronounceable to any fluent Japanese speaker, the same way English words are transcribed and used as loanwords in Japanese. So I can't use fu and just declare that it's actually hu. Anyone reading it will pronounce it as hu. Some reasons I bothered to do all of this, by the way. First of all, just as an exercise for myself, it was fun and it got me to go over some materials for Irish, which I'm still only studying. I'm far less competent in me Irish than me Japanese. Second of all, like I mentioned in the video, I actually transcribe Irish words, especially people's names, into Irish for my job. I think it helps to have something to refer to justify my decisions, even if the thing I'm referring to is made by myself. I would have loved to be able to refer to the textbook as an authoritative source whenever my transcriptions were questioned, but as I hope I've made clear in this video, I couldn't use the textbook system. It would end up being far less accurate to how people actually say their names, even for people who actually speak Irish. There's still plenty of parts of this that I'm open to changing. I think the biggest one is how I've dealt with glide vowels. I've just chosen to focus on the broad versus slender distinction for consonants, and then transcribe the, main vowels, the ones which actually appear in a phonemic transcription. So, kead became kedo, and like in the example sentences earlier at the end, anhin became anhin. So that schwa right before the last consonant in anhin just disappears. I think you might be able to come up with a consistent system that includes these more obvious glide vowels without having to allow loads of way more subtle ones, but I'm not sure. When I was thinking about this aspect of the language, I half remembered a quote that I think Gearóid Ó Nualáin wrote. It was something like, "In Irish the consonant is king, and the vowels will sort themselves." Maybe someone else can find the quote I'm talking about, because I couldn't when I looked for it. Another thing is that I actually found a copy of the textbook Learning Irish, which is a textbook focused on Coisharga Irish, translated into Japanese. It was in fact translated by the same Professor Nashimoto. I checked his transcription in that book in case there were any differences, and there actually were. In Learning Irish, he actually transcribed "ah," that's Irish long A, to Japanese "ah" instead of "o." So he agrees with me in that book, but not the book I showed in this video. That boosted my confidence a bit with respect to that particular decision. I'm still not a fan of the switching between ho and ha for ch. After discussing as many examples as we could find with an actual Japanese professor, who specialises in writing systems funnily enough, it seems that transcriptions of ch like to just match the vowel before it. So the German composer Bach becomes Bacha, but Van Gogh becomes Van Gogh. So ha is used when the previous vowel is a, and ho is used when the previous vowel is o. We found plenty more examples of this pattern and I really don't like it. No other consonant sound does this at all. Another annoying pattern, which I already mentioned in this video, was the use of fu when ch is at the start of a word and followed by a consonant, like Khrushchev becoming Furushchofu. We found plenty of Polish and Russian place names where this is used. I once again don't like this, and I find it completely inconsistent with how any other consonant is transcribed. Like for example, word final T goes to to, and word initial T before a consonant also goes to to. It doesn't suddenly go to tsu. That would make no sense. I would really like to say we should just use ho for all cases instead of this switching between ha and ho. But I can't help but suspect that Japanese speakers will see this and think that there is an actual o vowel in a lot of cases if we do that. It's just an annoying fact that this is how ha is transcribed and we might just have to deal with it. I would still stick with what I wrote in the video and never use fu. Alright, that's it. That's all my last random remarks. If I keep thinking about it, I'm sure I could come up with more and this video will never end. So let's not let that happen. This is it. Bye-bye. Please like and subscribe and comment. And most of all, subscribe. Please, subscribe. Seriously, if you watched this all the way to the end, why are you not subscribing? You've just listened to me rant about the most niche shit for 1 hour. Clearly, you're interested in what I have to say. Subscribe, 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 subscribe.